God has a hard-on.
Perfect world was a dream between the primitive cerebrals.
He's a traitor! He's a sadist!
You're all going to die down here.
The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
Happy heresies, my beloved truth seekers. Welcome to a restful yet soul-challenging niche in the cyberspace called the Virtual Alexandria, in the website called theGodAboveGod.com. You know it as Aeon Byte, although once it was called Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis, or Coffee, Coffin Nails, and Gnosis.
Ready your breakfast and eat hearty. For tonight, we dine in hell!
You know how life is. We work our jobs, we love our lovers, we relish our families, we fraternize with our friends, we escape through glass-gated mediums and familiar hobbies. We reward ourselves for the sweat on our brow and hope one day we'll retire in our raisin bodies with half of our faculties intact.
Most people are so ungrateful to be alive, but not you.
We do it all over every morning. We once in a while take a breather, stop and listen to our hearts, reminisce of innocent days and wonder what's it all about. How can we not? The shadow of death lingers like lint on your coat you want to ignore, but you know it's just there even when you're not paying attention. So we lean on higher goals, conditional love, and those Kodak moments. But the faint breeze of death is still there, and it's not alone, for there is a flicker of meaning we avoid every day in our role to fit into a planet of billions that is but a planet of more billions of planets.
I think you've been afraid all your life.
What is the meaning of this? We age, suffer, drink our small victories, and still wonder what is the meaning of this. Most of us consigned ourselves to a greater reward after death, but there are those of us who know that the reward is a fool's paradise. We know that buy now and pay later can only be a loaded promises, like it is in the material world. As above, so below. We know that we really aren't free, just caught in an upriver salmon stream where we'll flounder, die in so many ways, and end up as some crumpled picture in someone's photo album or dusty hallway.
There's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad.
And there are those who do not accept this galactic Groundhog Day. There must be something more, a higher reality where all the material toys don't mean anything, where only unconditional love exists, where we can be free to be ourselves regardless of what earthly prison we're in. There must be a way to defeat death before it comes.
There must be some kind of way out of here.
And we are called the Gnostics, and to escape the jail that is time and space, the tomb that is our bodies, as Plato said, the maze that is our mundane, prosaic lives, we write our own gospels and live our own myths. We run with those searching for the truth and avoid those who have found it. We learn that there is something so sublime, ineffable, and eternal inside of us that has been asleep for aeons, and we make our way into our own mysteries. We thrive at the edge of the night and canyons of imagination.
But where is it written that all our dreams must be small ones?
And ultimately we experience gnosis, that salvific knowledge of the heart, that direct experience with the divine that makes us an unbound Prometheus instead of just organic androids for the god of this world and his broken dream factories.
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore!
And one of the first steps, as Jesus tells Judas in the Apocryphon of James, I believe, is through love and kindness. Love and kindness. Walk through that doorway and more doors will open in the hallways of the great unknown, of a dark odyssey through the gnashing rocks of Orthodoxy. Add truth to that and you'll begin a very hard road, but one that not only will bring you true fulfillment in your role as a benign stranger of the universe, but one that can aid others, individually and collectively, who have suffered in their incarnations.
If we live our lives the right way, then every single thing we do becomes a work of art.
One such group is, of course, the Jews. It's no stretch of the imagination to say that anti-Semitism began with Christianity. In ancient times, people conquered one another for the purpose of servitude and real estate. Few groups cared what gods their slaves worshipped, only what hands they had to toil the soil. In fact, on a small side note, the Romans, before conquering a people, always sacrificed to their enemies' gods in order for the deity to change allegiance. Well, as we can see, Jehovah didn't waste any time jumping on the Roman bandwagon, probably sowing the seeds of his future masterpiece, the Holy Roman Empire.
What have the Romans ever done for us? Brought peace. Oh, peace! Shut up!
Anyway, Christianity, as it became a world player in the West, began to co-opt and resent the same religion their Savior came from. They needed a root to their new doctrine, but for that root to be an unquestionable continuation. Marcion tried to break away and leave the Jews to themselves, but he lost in the end. So resentment grew in Orthodoxy when the Jews wouldn't accept Jesus as their Messiah and allegedly had a paw in killing him, although that's ironic because that's the reason he came down to earth, right?
He's not the Messiah! He's a very naughty boy!
The cosmic stage of the Orthodox Jesus was all about his death and resurrection, right? If not, mankind couldn't have been saved, right? So why not thank all of those involved, especially Judas, who has been the symbol for Judaism proper to the Christian for 2,000 years? Who knows? It seems a scapegoat is necessary for Orthodoxy, even when drunk with the elixir of salvation and domination, and the Jews have been one of them.
There's no pleasing some people. That's just what Jesus said, sir!
Even the modern evangelists need the Jews for end-time prophecies, although most get charred in the end. It has been a very sad situation that really hasn't changed in the world if you look closely. Love and kindness. What happened to that? And worst of all is that all these polemics against Judaism might have been an involving reconstruction by Orthodoxy to give the Romans, their eventual allies, a big fat pass.
The more you make a big deal out of denying something, the more people think it must be true.
And that is why we have the pleasure of having Gary Greenberg a second time, discussing his new book, The Judas Brief, Who Really Killed Jesus. Gary performs surgery on the Gospels, as well as uses historical and apocryphal sources to reveal that it was never the Jews who were responsible for the death of the Orthodox Jesus.
Crucifixion lasts hours. It's a slow, horrible death.
Well, at least it gets you out in the open air.
He also exposes that the silence, the omissions, the inconsistencies, and the contradictions of the Bible are very loud in supporting his thesis. And I have a feeling, seeing how Judas has been exonerated in the last few decades through literature, film, and a new gospel, that most of us will even agree, even many of us who still will not admit in the cellars of fundamentalism.
The one who sits amongst us has already betrayed me this night. Who can it be? Judas! Do you want a beverage? Try the mulled wine. It's terrific. No! Leave us alone! Go!
Some things are so obvious but not allowed to be voiced until we have an oasis in time where free speech and an open culture are actually tolerated for a while. And this is just another sunbeam of the truth we bring to you at Aeon Byte in over 100 shows. One that subconsciously many of you already knew but didn't know how to articulate it. But no mas. The Judas Brief delivers enough evidence you'll probably never dispute who really killed Jesus. Which again should have been a positive thing in the larger scheme of things. But never try to ask Orthodoxy to make too much sense, or you'll eat so much cognitive dissonance you'll end up with a damaged brain that can only repeat the faith statements handed down through generations of literalist dogma.
And on the third day, God created the Remington bolt-action rifle so that man could fight the dinosaurs and the homosexuals.
Amen.
And of all ironies, something history seems to be half made of, is that one of the modern polemics against the Gnostics is that we are anti-Semites. I've heard it in message boards and even from the mouths of evangelical pastors. Yes, my beloved truth seekers, the Gnostics hate the Jews.
Are you running a high fever? How could you conceive of something so idiotic?
Besides the fact the Gnostics were always pacifists throughout history and hatred is not part of our lexicon, I markedly find a few problems with this charge. We must address this because Orthodoxy will always attempt to bury us truth seekers in some synthetic cesspool of corrosive theological chemicals. The first problem with Gnostics being anti-Semites is that the original Gnostics were Jews, for crying out loud, or in my soup. They were probably Hellenistic or Alexandrian Jews who splintered away from the corrupt temple establishment and the repression of Judea long before Christianity.
You can't handle the truth!
I don't want to get into the infamous question of whether a group can insult itself and get away from it, but I think it's reasonable to say that this could never make them anti-Semite. They were bloody Jews. As for the question that they were blasphemous Jews, there perhaps we can agree, but that's neither here nor there. Josephus, Philo, and many of the church fathers write about the many flavors of Judaism in ancient times. There were many sects back then. They were as diverse and fluid as Christianity is today. I'm sure they gave each other the finger often and barked the heretic charge, but one man's blasphemy is another man's prayer.
It's not what you know, it's what you can prove.
Besides, the Gnostics weren't just being heretical because they wanted to insult the Orthodox in Jerusalem like the Monty Python French soldier. No, they simply glanced at the Old Testament and interpreted things much differently. Mainly because they were tired, very tired. They wondered why Jehovah had left his people in slavery, war, and famine since he had made them his chosen. And the demiurge, in the disguise of other gods, has done that to his various people across the world if you hadn't noticed.
As long as the Matrix exists, the human race will never be free.
They decided to meditate upon this and indulge in other rituals, and wonder what had happened at the beginning before the beginning. Why is Genesis so silent on this? They also knew something was amiss with the two contradictory messages in Genesis. They began to suspect that the patriarchs, many of them selfish, bumbling, and not so smart oafs, had either been in cahoots with lower agencies or been told egregious mistruths by the Creator God. The early Gnostics cringed at the flood, at Abraham's attempted murder of his son, at Moses and his lack of character, at Joshua and his genocide, and the immense suffering the Israelites had gone through. Eventually, they discovered the truth that they had been played a cosmic joke like the rest of us humans. A cosmic and ugly joke. Worship a jealous God who loves you with his fists like some abusive alcoholic husband. There had to be more to the transmundane dog and pony show. Heaven couldn't be the greatest state of being after seeing who was the CEO. And slowly, they began to discover Sophia hidden in the Old Testament. They found Lady Wisdom in visions and what happened before Genesis. They found her in the Psalms and Ecclesiasticus and Micah, in the wisdom of Solomon and other places of the Tanakh. She was in the Jewish Bible, as important as the Creator God himself, but hidden because of the savvy hands of the men that had transcribed the message of the demiurge.
What's God? Well, you know, when you want something really bad and you close your eyes and you wish for it, God's the guy that ignores you.
I urge you to read Jim West's article on our website, thegodabovegod.com called Gnostics and the Old Testament, or download Aeon Byte number 68, all about Sophia with Jordan Stratford. But here are just a few examples I'm sure many of you have heard before. This is from the book of Proverbs, chapter 8, where at the beginning Sophia states exactly who she is. The Lord possessed me in the beginning of his way, before his works of old. I was set up from everlasting, from the beginning, wherever the earth was. Before the depths I was brought forth, when there were no fountains abounding with water. Before the mountains were settled, before the hills was I brought forth. While as yet he had not made the earth, nor the fields, nor the highest part of the dust of the world. When he prepared the heavens, I was there. When he set a compass upon the face of the depth. When he established the clouds above. When he strengthened the fountains of the deep. When he gave the sea his decree, that the waters should not pass his commandment. When he appointed the foundations of the earth. Then I was by him, as one brought up with him. And I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him, rejoicing in the habitable part of his earth, and my delights were with the sons of men.
Mother is the name for God on the lips and hearts of all children.
Or this is from Sirach chapter 24. Wisdom sings her own praises before her own people. She proclaims her glory. In the assembly of the Most High she opens her mouth. In the presence of his host she declares her worth. From the mouth of the Most High I came forth, and mist-light covered the earth. In the highest heavens did I dwell, my throne on a pillar of cloud. The vault of heaven I encompassed alone. Through the deep abyss I wandered, over waves of the sea, over all the land, over every people and nation I held sway, and I shall never fail. So the ancient Gnostics couldn't be anti-Semite when they had found Sophia herself in the Jewish scriptures, and they had simply written one of the first midrash, or Jewish critical interpretation or explanation, on what happened at the beginning of time with the help of Platonic philosophy and mystical junkets. And the Christian Gnostics later on continued the tradition that it was angels and archons and demons, oh my, who created and controlled existence, not Sophia and the aeons, the personhoods and potentials of the sublime, ultimate, and ennoblable reality called a pleroma. And best of all, we are part of this pleroma.
We are star stuff. We are the universe, made manifest, trying to figure itself out.
Like Simon Magus wrote in the Great Annunciation, there is in everyone the divine power existing in the latent condition. This one power divided above and below, generating itself, making itself grow, seeking itself, finding itself, daughter of itself, son of itself, mother, father, unity, being a source of the entire circle of existence. So let's get over this canard that the ancient and modern Gnostics were and are anti-Semite. And let's get over this canard that the gospel accounts are not anti-Semite. We go with Gary Greenberg to discuss the Judas Brief and show the world where the endless hunting of Jews truly began. The Gnostics found Sophia. The Jews wanted to be left alone, but both Gnostic and Jews have actually more in common because we've been both bitch-slapped like red-headed orphans for so many centuries.
Prepare to taste God's wrath.
When does it stop? Right now it begins to stop with another photon of truth, exposing the vile injustice of the powers and principalities of this cosmos. Gary Greenberg now discussing the Judas Brief. With love and kindness. With love and kindness. Hello and goodbye as always.
On my challenge, by the ancient laws of combat, we are met at this chosen ground to settle for good and all who holds sway over the 5 points. Us natives, born rightwise to this fine land, or the foreign hordes defiling it.
Today we have the pleasure of having for a second time Gary Greenberg. Today we'll be discussing his new book, The Judas Brief, Who Really Killed Jesus. How are you doing today, Gary?
Good. How's it going?
Everything is wonderful. Again, thank you very much for joining the show and giving us some pretty shocking scholarship. But first of all, what was the main reason for you writing the Judas Brief?
Well, I started out just doing research into the New Testament. I wanted to do a follow-up originally to 101 Myths of the Bible and do something for the New Testament. And as I started doing that, I began to realize there were an awful lot of incoherencies in the narratives, particularly with regard to the Jews. And I just started to explore that in more detail. Eventually, I got sidetracked from the original project and started to focus on the Passion story, dealing with what role, if any, the Jews played in the death of Jesus.
And it seems that your thesis is that as the Gospels evolved, there were more cosmetics, to put it lightly, to put more and more blame on the Jews and less blame on the Romans and the Herodians.
Yeah, that seems to be the trend as you start looking in the Christian literature, beginning with the earliest literature and moving out. It's a continuous trend to downplay or minimize the Roman involvement and increase Jewish involvement.
Do you think this happened, or what period do you think this happened? Do you think it happened as Rome became more and more Christianized?
Well, we see it starting with the Gospels, and what I try to show in the book is that there were earlier stories, and that they were and based on variations within the Gospels, we can see how these stories were altered and changed from one Gospel to another. One of the principles I tried to set out for analyzing what the original stories were was to wherever you had an inconsistency in which one story portrayed the Jews in a better light than another, or another one portrayed the Romans in a worse light than another, then the one that shows the Jews in the better light is probably closer to the original story, and the one that shows the Romans in the worse light is probably closer to the original story, because it's unlikely that someone who was anti-Jewish or pro-Roman would change a story to make an anti-Jewish story more Jewish or a pro-Roman story more anti-Roman. Well, you were talking about when this started. I said it's at least as early as Mark and probably a lot earlier, because in Mark we see what I see as must be alterations in the Passion story, in which he has rearranged events to minimize Pilate's involvement in what happened. In Mark, for example, Pilate is isolated from the Roman soldiers mocking Jesus. He's sort of separated out from that story, while the other Gospels have John and Luke have Jesus in a much more hostile relationship with Pilate. Pilate's more actively involved in the harassment of Jesus. And we see both through John and Luke that there was an alternative version of the gospel story that Mark seems to have altered.
And out of the four Gospels, do you see any of them being more anti-Semite than the other, or they're all pretty much four equally anti-Jewish?
I don't think it was a question of anti-Semite. I think we have polemics. And polemics tend to exaggerate a great deal and find tiny little things and build them up big. I think one kind of polemic that went on is in the story, in my book, I blame the Herod Antipas for much of what happened, and he's quasi-Jewish. He's sort of half Roman, half Jewish, and so he gets mixed treatment. And so to the extent he was Jewish, I think they took the fact that he was Jewish without naming him and say the Jews did this or the Jews did that. That's an example of polemic, I think. And I think you have a lot of polemic. Matthew is much more polemical, I think, than the others. John has a good deal of polemic in it. Luke has a lot of strange backtracking and manipulation, not so much as polemical, although there are a lot of problems in Luke.
And Gary, you spend a lot of time revealing Bible inconsistencies to begin with. What is the purpose of this?
Well, the idea is to, by comparing the stories and looking at the inconsistencies, to see if there's anything we can draw out as a factual issue. For example, the entire trial, Jewish trial in Mark of Jesus, makes no logical, historical, coherent sense whatsoever. The whole thing is absurd on a historical and narrative level. So you look to see if in the other Gospels, for example, there's some kind of different approaches. In John, there's no trial at all. In Luke, it's moved from night to day, and it's not quite a trial with no verdict. Because one of the problems you had was that, I think it was Geza Vermesh who says that if there was a trial of Jesus by the Jews, it broke about every rule in the book in terms of Jewish law. Nighttime trials, holiday trials, these kinds of things just didn't happen. So you look for places where there are inconsistencies and see if anything seems to line up with the historical reality, what should make historical sense versus what seems to be inconsistent with history. So you use that as a tool to try to piece together what may have happened.
And at the end of the day, we really don't know what Jesus was accused of by the Jews. There seems to be several reasons,
Well, the Gospels jump around to different claims. There's a lot of inconsistency. One of the strangest things that I found, really bizarre, which doesn't seem to get commented on too much, although it might, in the mission part of the Jesus story, where he's going around and the Jews are confronting him, all the Gospels have these claims about violating the Sabbath laws and seeking to put him to death and so on. So you would think if that were the case, or, Mark talks about, the conspiracy to kill Jesus as a result of violating the Sabbath, healing on the Sabbath and so on. And John has Jews trying to stone him to death for violating the Sabbath. So you would think that if he's being put on trial, that would be a big issue at the trial, that he was violating the Sabbath. Yet that doesn't even come up in any way in the trial story in the Passion Week. So that's a very strange inconsistency.
Yeah, and the turning of the tables at the temple doesn't even come up in the trial, does it? And
right.
That's one of the reasons they wanted to kill him. Or Lazarus.
Mm-hmm. Right. You have these changing stories. As a matter of fact, John, I think, gets to the core of what was really going on. John has no trials. John says before Jesus came into Jerusalem, or as he was coming in that time frame, there was a meeting. It was theoretically after the Lazarus incident. And the concern is that as a result of the Lazarus incident, Jesus is going to become more popular, and the Romans will be very upset. The Romans will destroy the nation. And then you get this polemical spin about it's better that one man die than the whole nation, and so on and so forth, which is sort of John's intended ironies about Caiaphas not actually understanding that Jesus was the Savior. But it's very clear that what seems to be going on from John is that it's the Romans that are the threat, and the Jews are worried that the popularity of Jesus is going to bring the Romans down on their head. And that's where the story in my book goes. That's the direction I move in. We had just had a rebellion led by Barabbas. which is downplayed a little in the later Gospels, but, or Mark makes it clear we're talking about a military rebellion and of some sort in which people died. Barabbas was a leader or one of the leaders. His name, incidentally, in Aramaic would be Son of the Father, which is a very strange name and suggests a leadership title of some sort. So you see this theme developing. It's really the Romans that are outraged, and that would be consistent with the historical reality. The Jews never got involved in any of these disputes over would-be messiahs. There are several messiah stories in Josephus, and it's always the Romans who are cracking down, not the Jews.
And like you say, Gary, the Jews were not allowed to have a death sentence trial unless they went to the Romans first.
Right.
We have
some historical evidence that if the Jews wanted to conduct a capital crimes trial, they had to get permission from the Roman governor first. And that seems to be missing in the story, which would indicate that the Romans would have known what was going on, and it wouldn't have been such a big surprise, supposedly, to Pilate when Jesus is brought, that he would have had advanced knowledge. And in John, Roman troops are the dominant group that are arresting Jesus. It's the Roman, a large group of Roman soldiers that make the arrest of Jesus, with some Jews theoretically accompanying them. But it's a very large group of soldiers.
And needless to say, going historically, which doesn't add up to the Gospels, but the Pontius Pilate of the Bible is not the same as the historical Pontius Pilate, is he?
No, and that's one of the key problems with the Gospel accounts. We know something from extra-biblical sources about what kind of person Pilate was. He was an extraordinarily stubborn man, unbending. He, as even reflected in the Gospels, he and Herod Antipas had been enemies, very likely because Herod Antipas and other members of the Herodian family had an earlier conflict with Pilate that led to Pilate's severe embarrassment when they complained apparently to the emperor about something Pilate had done. Pilate had a reputation for being cruel, for putting people to death without trials. We have, some contemporary writing dealing with this. So there's no way he would have been yielding to, if he determined he wanted something done, he did it. He wouldn't get into arguments with people about it. He would say, this is what I'm doing. And he certainly wouldn't yield in any way to the Sadducees, who were the priestly class. Whatever they had, they owed to him. There's no way they would take an antagonistic or rebellious attitude towards Pilate. Pilate had control of the priestly vestments that they needed for the holidays. He would have used that as a tool. And he could remove the priest at will. There's no way there would have been any priestly opposition to what Pilate said or did in any confrontational way as it's depicted in the Bible.
So the scene in which Pilate is trying to tell the Jewish crowd that Jesus is innocent of this and that is probably would have never happened. Pilate would have not.
Couldn't have happened. He would, in the book, I try to show that a lot of that scene is largely satirical. Not satirical, but sadistic, actually. Pilate is, one of the things that's almost never well discussed in the histories of what happened is the makeup of the crowd and who would have been there and what kind of people would have been in the audience. And, it's my thesis that people from the Jesus movement and such would be calling for his release. And Pilate is basically making sarcastic remarks about your king. I mean, obviously those couldn't be aimed at the priest. Why would he say to the priest, your king? I mean, the very point that the priests are allegedly protesting is he's not their king. So conversations that are presented as sort of two-dimensional between Pilate and the priest are really multidimensional between Pilate and various factions, playing one off against another in a sarcastic and a sadistic manner.
And needless to say, there's no evidence of this releasing one prisoner at Passover in history.
We don't have any direct evidence for that. It could be a true story that there was some sort of tradition, but the Gospels all disagree on what the tradition was. One says it was a Jewish tradition that Pilate released somebody. Well, it can't be a Jewish tradition that the Roman governor released somebody. It has to be a Roman tradition. Another gospel, makes it a Roman tradition. You have inconsistencies. Now, it's certainly possible that there could have been something like that. However, Pilate was an extraordinarily corrupt governor, took bribes, and it's not inconsistent that he would have taken bribes to allow people to be released.
It was basically the historical Pilate's job to squash any sort of messianic, any messianic movement. It was not a Jewish.
Right, and you have to remember context. There had just been some sort of a rebellion in which people died, very possibly Roman soldiers. Arrests had been made, and there's no way the Romans were going to allow some independent radical movement opposing Rome, Roman guidance, to allow Pilate to release somebody. He would have offended his own troops if he was doing that, and that's the last thing he would have wanted to do. And we know from history as the way Pilate acted, there would have been a large number of Roman troops, both ringing perhaps the crowds and in disguise within the crowds looking for troublemakers. We have incidents in history where Pilate did that sort of thing.
And are there any other examples of Romans being given a pass as villains in arresting, interrogating, and executing Jesus? I think in one of the Gospels, it's actually Herod who interrogates Jesus, right?
Well, we have a Herod interrogation in Luke, which sort of shifts blame away somewhat from Pilate, makes Herod the interrogator, and then even Herod supposedly says Jesus is innocent, although he gets mocked and sent back in a purple robe and so on. What's really going on, how did Herod even get into this in the first place? And the broader thing, we know from the Gospel, just prior to the Jerusalem episode, before the Passion Week, we find out in Luke that Herod wanted Jesus put to death, very likely for the same reasons he put John the Baptist to death. He had a popular following, and that made him a threat, even though no threat actually emerged. And Jesus says, well, if he wants to do something to me, let him follow me to Jerusalem. The broader theory, the outline in the story, basically, that we should be aware of, is that in the light of the rebellion, the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem was afraid that there'd be a Roman pogrom of some sort, a major Roman crackdown on crowds and radicals and so on because of the riots that had just occurred. So they were trying to work out a formula to avoid this Roman riot. One of the questions, for example, that Paul Fredrickson asks is, why only Jesus and not his disciples or followers? How come only Jesus himself got singled out? And it's a very good question. I have a different answer than she does. But so what I argue is that, and try to provide evidence for, is that the Jewish leadership was working out a tripart arrangement between Jesus and Pilate to avoid bloodshed, because we know it would have been huge number of innocent people would have died in riots. And the agreement that I propose took place is that Jesus guaranteed that his followers would remain quiet during the holidays by going into house arrest with the high priest, with the family of the high priest, and remain there through the holidays to be released later. And that was the agreement Pilate agreed to, since it was a win-win situation for him. And so the agreement was initiated. Judas, in my argument, is the one who negotiated on behalf of Jesus what the terms of this agreement would be. And when Herod learned about the agreement, he's the one who pressured Pilate to break the terms of the agreement. And what you hear, what the debates and arguments were about was really Pilate backing out of the agreement and ordering Jesus produced. And whatever debates the Jews were having was, how do we react to the order of Pilate to produce Jesus, given the agreement we had, and do we resist or do we give in to the violence? And that's what really occurred, is they feared the violence. And so after the agreement was broken by Pilate, Jesus was turned over. In the polemics later, the Jews are accused simply of turning Jesus over to Pilate without a context.
And speaking of Judas, you also proposed that he was really not really a negative character in early Christian circles.
No, I suggest that image developed later. As the story developed, as there was more anti-Judaism in the polemics over the years, because Judas played a key role in the negotiations that led to the turnover of Jesus, he became symbolic. They also needed to undermine Judas somewhat, because he's the one. He was apparently well known and associated with the story of chastising Jesus for betraying the poor by spending huge amounts of money on ointment, money that could have been used to help the poor. And the story must have been incredibly well known. Variations of it appear in all the Gospels with a lot of changes. And in the Synoptic Gospels, they hide the identity of who made the complaint to Jesus. In John, it's actually Judas. So we see he must have been relatively influential, not afraid to take on a failing of Jesus successfully, apparently. And so they had to diminish his reputation in many ways. And that happened. We find as early as the writings of Paul, when talking about what happened, he doesn't identify Judas as a betrayer. He just says it was the night that Jesus was handed over. And it's in the context of him defending himself as an apostle, having criticized Peter. Paul would have missed no opportunity to criticize other apostles if he could get away with it. And he has no criticism of Judas.
Yeah, and one of the clues you give is the word betray can also be translated as handed over, right?
Right, that's the original meaning. And throughout the Gospels, whenever the Greek word for hand over is used, it's usually translated as handed over, except when it involves Judas. And then it's translated as betrayed. And that's because of the later depiction of Judas as betraying Jesus and selling him out. That's a later interpretation. I think what happened early on is Judas was known as the one who turned over Jesus because of these negotiations that I describe, initially turning him over to the high priest and then his eventually being turned over to Pilate. We even have a hint of his upset over that when, in Mark, when he becomes terribly upset, or in Matthew, when he becomes terribly upset at seeing Jesus being brought to Pilate. Obviously, he didn't expect that. That wasn't part of the original agreement. Early on, he became associated in a kind of almost a Homeric way with an epitaph of being the one who handed over. And then as the act became more despised, it took on the more negative interpretation.
And I've always thought one of the clues, or a couple of clues that you give in your book, is one, Jesus promises the 12 seats of Israel in heaven, and Judas is present.
Right. He promises, in one version of the story, Jesus promises each of the 12 disciples will sit on a throne. Will sit on the 12 disciples, and I think in Matthew it's 12 disciples will sit on 12 thrones, and Judas is one of those disciples. Luke changes it slightly to thrones, not 12 thrones, and sort of fudges it a little bit. Both, I think, are quoting very likely the Q source, unless Luke is just editing Matthew.
And also Paul, doesn't Paul say that he appeared to the 12 when they hadn't replaced Judas yet?
Right. So we have a lot of clear evidence that Judas was thought of as one of the disciples in good standing after Easter week. And in the Gospel of Peter, which was probably written close in time to the Gospel of John, and which actually appeared to have been used as scripture in some churches in Syria and elsewhere, Judas is depicted as one of the 12 disciples after the execution, going home in sadness for what happened without any indication that he had been involved in any form of wrongdoing, even though that gospel depicts a trial under Herod and depicts Herod as having a role in the persecution of Jesus. I'm trying to isolate Herod a bit and blame it on the Jews as a Jewish trial, but he also, like Luke, has a Herod involvement. So we see even as late as perhaps the late 1st century, early 2nd century, there's a narrative track in which Judas has not yet been condemned as evil.
Why do you think the Pharisees are so vilified throughout the Gospels when they were known to have a softer interpretation of the Torah?
Yes, I think what happened, and one of the arguments that's made for the late authorship of the Gospels, is that they stem from an era in which, after the Roman revolt in 66, most of the other factions were wiped out, basically. They don't exist anymore after the Roman revolt. Only the Pharisees survived as a major faction along with Herodians. And at this point, Christianity had taken on a strong Gentile cast, an argument with the Jewish leadership, and we're arguing this post-Easter Christianity, which was very different from what Jesus was preaching about the way things should be. During Jesus' mission, he was very anti-Gentile, anti-Samaritan. And after the mission, you have Paul opening it up to Gentiles and so on. You begin to get a lot of debates, probably after the revolt, between Christian followers and Pharisees, in which the Christian followers don't really know the Bible very well. They're relying on the Septuagint, not the Hebrew, and they're just wrong about a lot of things, or at least from the Pharisee viewpoint. And so there's probably a lot of hostile debate going on. Since the Pharisees were the primary opponents of Christians in the later period, the gospel authors retroject them back as the primary opponents in the missionary period. And even though the Sadducees were the priesthood at that time, they're virtually invisible in the Gospels. Even though the priesthood was Sadducee, you would think there would be a bigger, and they were the ones in the Gospels leading the persecution of Jesus and Passion Week. You'd think you would see a bigger role for the Sadducees in the Gospels, but they're not there. They're almost invisible. I mean, you don't even get the name Sadducee. I mean, the name is mentioned in a couple of places, but they don't even reveal that the priesthood was Sadducee in the Gospels. Luke lets it slip in Acts, but it's not even mentioned in the Gospels that the priesthood was Sadducee. They leave you with the impression they might have been Pharisees. So I think what happened is the later debates, it was assumed the same thing must have happened earlier, because they had a different a picture of what Jesus was like in those later years than from what was going on in the early period when, right after his death, the inner circle formed a very orthodox, strict Jewish religious sect.
And even if there was, let's say Jesus was going around arguing with Pharisees, in the Jewish context, there's nothing wrong with these type of debates.
No, the Pharisees argued with themselves. There were splits within the Pharisees. Pharisees argued with other Jews. And Jesus argued within a Pharisee context. His arguments with them were often Pharisaic arguments, some of which appear in other Jewish writings. Similar arguments that he used appeared in some Pharisaic writings. So there was nothing particular that Jesus was teaching that would have made him a particular enemy. And, one of the biggest attacks on Jesus attributed to the Pharisees is to put him to death for violating the Sabbath. But the Pharisees didn't believe in a death penalty for the Sabbath. They barely believed in a death penalty at all. The penalty that the Pharisees basically advocated, as mentioned in Leviticus and mentioned in the Mishnah, was the sacrifice of a pigeon. 2 doves or something would have been the penalty for violating the Sabbath. So the whole hostility that is invented, the Sabbath violation stories, are pure fiction.
And Jesus seems to be wandering around like some James Bond in the 4 Gospels, where they're always plotting to kill him. Yeah. Do you think these were just added to make, again, as polemic as Jews? They want to kill him here, they want to kill him there.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. Luke adds a death plot that didn't exist in Mark, or Matthew. When Jesus goes to Nazareth and gets a hostile reaction, he moves the story to the beginning of his gospel, practically the mission gospel, and has the Jews try to throw Jesus off a cliff. You have a lot of that kind of thing happening, but basically there was nothing to be hostile about. I mean, John the Baptist was very well beloved by Jewish people. He was highly respected. The Gospels make a big point of how respected John the Baptist was among the Jews. So if he was so respected among the Jews, why is there a reason to think there was much hostility towards Jesus? It was pretty much in the same tradition.
And Jesus never even gave pretty much a hint of who he was. He never said I was a revolutionary or the new Messiah.
Yeah, but he does say, in Matthew, he does say, do what the Pharisees tell you. They sit on the throne of Moses, and you should follow what the Pharisees teach. Not their attitudes necessarily, which were being alleged to be somewhat hypocritical, but their teachings. Jesus was making the Pharisees, if Matthew can be trusted, as the religious guideline for what his followers should do. That was his teaching. So you have that Mark, remarkably, one of the great mysteries of Mark scholarship is what they call the Messianic Secret. No living person during Jesus' lifetime seems to have any idea that he's this Messiah figure. The closest you get is Peter alleging that he's a Messiah in a conversation with Jesus, and he gets the definition of Messiah all wrong, and Jesus chastises him. So no living individuals in Mark had any idea that Jesus was supposed to be the Messiah. Jesus didn't want anybody saying he was the Messiah. He told his disciples, if they think that, to keep it a secret. So you have this very clear picture that there was, from Mark, that Jesus was not a Messiah figure in his lifetime. People were not hailing him as a Messiah. And there are Mark subtly arranges a number of passages to downplay the fact that people may have thought he was a Messiah by having slightly different language than you appear in the other Gospels. It's a very interesting problem, and part of it is because he wasn't thought of as a Messiah when he was alive. For Mark, it was only after his death, that you could understand who he really was. And that's what really happened. Following the death of Jesus, an entirely different theology developed about what Jesus was about.
And even the argument of him coming from the Davidic line is questioned all throughout the Gospels, right?
Right. As a matter of fact, Mark has no such claim. But Mark has a story in which Jesus argues in the temple that the son of David or a Davidic descendant couldn't be the Messiah. And in John, you have Jews saying, how could he be the Messiah if he isn't descended from David? And John makes no allegation of any sort that argument is wrong. For John, Jesus goes back to the beginning of time. His birth is unimportant. And for Mark, Jesus is the Son of God, but doesn't explain what he means by that term. It's only Mark and Matthew that come up with the Davidic lineage in a hope of some way connecting him to a Davidic tradition. But the two of them are so inconsistent about the story of how Jesus came to be born that it's clear that at least one, if not both, stories are complete fabrications.
And another great clue is during the trial of Mark, and the trial in Mark, the high priest says, "Are you the son of the Blessed One?" Isn't that not completely anti-Jewish, that term?
Well, it's not that it's anti-Jewish. There's no evidence Jews would have ever used that term to describe God. There's no literary evidence that that term was ever used. That's part of Mark's attempt to sort of cover up or to explain away why Jesus wasn't being the Messiah. And you have, it's a very complicated issue here, but in each of the Gospels, there's a different treatment of that question, or at least in the Synoptic Gospels. You have a different treatment of that question. And as I'd like to point out, they're combining two titles of Jesus into one question. So when he's giving a yes or a no, which is yes in Mark, no in Matthew and Luke, what is he saying yes or no to? Both titles, one title, or not? As I point out, as a trial lawyer tactic, you never put two questions together. You always break a question down. Are you the Son of God? Are you the Messiah? Luke does that. Luke breaks it down and then does some other interesting thing. Luke is obviously concerned that there's an issue there. And it's clear that everybody is struggling at this time to try to figure out what the identity of Jesus really is, what titles should be applied to him, what he was claiming, what they think he was claiming. There's a lot of inconsistency in the gospel accounts.
So it seems that it was just the whole kangaroo court was written to basically blame the Jews for wanting Jesus dead.
Right. That was the theme that emerged. Given the opposition of Pharisees to later Christian teaching, they retrojected it back as an anti-Jewish movement, anti-Jewish attitude. The Jews were anti-Christian or anti-Jesus, but there's no reason to think in any way that Jews in the time of Jesus while he was alive had any negative concerns about Jesus at all. Nothing he was teaching or doing was in any way controversial in any significant way to Jews, and his teachings were in line with the Pharisees. There was nothing. Now, part of the problem, of course, from Jesus studies is to try to figure out what part of the mission represents real history and what part represents fictional accounts put into the history by the later writers. So admittedly, there is that problem that has to be separated out. But within the broad picture of how scholars see what's real and what's made up, you can see that Jesus was essentially a mainstream Jewish figure. Nothing particularly unusual about him. His message may have been strong and had a following and not necessarily the dominant view, but it was nothing particularly inconsistent in any significant way with what many Jews considered part of the tradition.
And the bottom line, no matter what you argue, is that everything went through the Romans. The Romans were the ones in charge of any, putting to death any would-be messiahs or charismatic Jewish leaders.
Right. In the book, I try to go through all the known incidents that we have in which such kinds of figures may have been put to death, and what the Jewish role, if any, was, and what the Roman role, if any, was.
Do we have any clues in Paul about Jesus?
Well, we have very little. Paul, who's the closest in time to Jesus as a Christian writer, says almost nothing about Jesus during his lifetime. But Paul, the whole thing is the resurrection. Paul's just come up with this new spin on the whole story. The only thing that mattered to Paul was that Jesus was resurrected. That was his belief and message. And that's where the Christianity took another direction. I'm not saying Paul necessarily originated that idea, but he taught it. And that was inconsistent pretty much with what happened earlier. Although there may have been a belief in a resurrection, Paul took it in new directions. But he has very, very little to say. You know, I try to discuss a few clues in some of his writings as it would have applied to what happened to Judas in the trial. But he has very, very little to say about Jesus while he was alive. And one of the mysteries is, which I don't go into in the book, is I believe there were a lot of psychological problems that Paul had involving his own anti-Christian behavior. Luke tries to say that Paul was acting on behalf of the high priest. Paul never makes that claim, and I strongly suspect Paul was working with Romans and that he may have actually had something to do with the death of Jesus and became extraordinarily guilty afterwards. And when Pilate was removed from office, he lost his protector, and he was hightailing it out of Jerusalem rather than going to make arrests in a territory that Jews had no control over. The story is very strange and bizarre about why Paul left Jerusalem and the road to Damascus. But I don't really get into that in this book.
Sadly, the way the Gospels and the New Testament came about has been a cause of suffering, a great suffering from Jews for many centuries. Right. Do you see a softening of Judas in the last, few decades with movies such as Jesus Christ Superstar and The Last Temptation of Christ and the New Gospel of Judas?
Within Western elitist circles, educational and elitist circles, you have a little bit of that sort of thing, not very much. In mainstream Christian circles throughout the world, particularly if you consider what the Catholic Church really is around the world as opposed to New York City, anti-Semitism is massive and large. Hatred for Jews is substantial. The Pope, the best the popes were able to do in modern times is say, not all Jews are responsible for what happened to Jesus. Just some Jews were. And, I'm arguing they have the story wrong. But anti-Semitism, if you go into the church in South America and Africa and Asia, they're following fundamental anti-Jewish teachings in the Gospels. There's no sophisticated modern spin throughout most of that culture, which is the overwhelming massive membership of the Catholic Church. And Protestants are generally pretty bad when it comes to how to treat Jews, and still are.
Yeah, and that's a pity. I hear stories of how even to this day in Eastern Europe, when it comes to Easter, Jews always end up getting beat up and attacked. It's just
a lot of Jews growing up in New York got beat up by the Italian and the Irish.
Well, I hope the book definitely brings some light and shows that the real hand that moved everything had to have been a Roman hand and not a Jewish hand. I hope your book helps.
I hope. Mm-hmm. I appreciate your efforts to discuss it with me.
Oh, the pleasure's all mine. Mm-hmm. But I think that's about all the time we have today.
Okay.
And I wish you the best of luck with the Judas Brief, and hopefully the message can get out and we can at least change some of the unfairness that goes around the world.
Thank you.
Well, you have yourself a good day, Gary, and thank you for coming on the show.
Okay, bye-bye.